Hello, welcome to the History of Women in America. My name is Amy Colon. I will be your instructor for the semester, and this is our very first lecture video. And we're going to start with the topic that I call Why Do We Study Women's History? Where does women's history come from? And to know that, you have to look at something called historiography. Historiography is simply the study of historians and how historians change their perspectives through time. Remember, historians are human and they are impacted by the times that they are living, and that impacts their perspective of history. So every generation of historians may look at history a little bit differently. So we're going to look at where does the study of women's history begin in the US. And really, we have to start with the decade of the 1960s. In the 1960s, there was a lot of change in American society. Americans' perceptions began to change. A lot of it had to do with the middle of the African American civil rights movement, which led to the modern women's rights movement. And, in the 60s, the civil rights movement was at a new height, and African Americans were fighting for their rights, and that in turn inspired other groups of people to fight for their equality in our society. Women, Hispanic Americans, Native Americans all began to demand more equal opportunity and equal treatment under the law. And there were some victories that we're going to be discussing later when we get to the 1960s, like the Equal Pay Act, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And as women and various minority groups began to gain more equality through these laws, historians at the time began to wonder what were the experiences of those people in history. If we look at history before the 1960s, historians tended to focus on leaders, economic leaders, political leaders, which typically in American history were white men. So there was a big emphasis on the study of wealthy white men. There was research into other groups. It was more superficial. So, yeah, mainly the focus was the leaders, and then once in a while they would look at what some Native Americans did or what some women did. But they were never the focus. So in the 1960s, there were young historians in graduate school who were impacted by the civil rights, women's rights movements, and they started to wonder, well, in history, what was the experience of everybody else, not just the leaders? And they began to look at history from new perspectives, from the perspective of women, perspectives of minority groups, perspectives of average people, the poor, immigrants, farmers, laborers, not just the leaders. New left historians began to open up new perspectives of history that we are still exploring today. So I'll give you an example. When you look at the history of the Revolutionary War, there's been a lot of research on George Washington. We know a lot about George Washington and his perspective and the other leaders' perspectives and why they fought and why they did what they did. But there isn't a lot of focus on the average soldier. What about the farmer in Rhode Island who decided to leave his family, pick up a weapon, and go fight the British? What was his perspective? What was his experience? What motivated him? That was largely left out of history books before the 1960s. So we have all of these new books being written after the 1960s, looking at history from many different perspectives, not just the perspectives of the leaders. And that's where women's history comes from in the US. It's because of these new perspectives that we have at colleges and universities today women's studies, African American studies, Hispanic studies, Native American studies. You can focus a history degree on a more minute topic than you could ever before. And so really new left historians did open up new perspectives of history that we're still exploring today. And that's why we study women's history. And that's where this course came from. It was really those new left historians that began to look at history from new perspectives in the 1960s. So that's where I'm going to leave this first video. And we're going to be looking at early American life in the next video. So see you then.